Earthworm Jim was one of the most creative characters to come out of the big mascot craze of the 1990s. The game itself was a parody of all the cliches that were happening back then. A princess damsel in distress, a scary villain, and of course a cool anthropomorphic animal protagonist. The game itself was developed by Shiny Entertainment, which in turn was comprised of ex-members of Virgin Interactive. They were famous for licensed games like The Terminator, Aladdin, The Jungle Book, and Cool Spot. Now, after having been creatively constrained by working on these licensed properties, the team didn't feel like being held back like that again. So in collaboration with the toy company Playmates Toys, they were finally able to create their own original IP. Apparently, being stuck working on games based on Disney movies makes you really creative, because the end result was unlike anything people had seen up until that point. Earthworm Jim is a game about an earthworm in a robot suit that goes around the universe blasting aliens and saving the princess what's-her-name from the evil Queen Slug for a butt. Now, does that make sense? No, but in a sea of mediocre Me Too copycat platformers that were around at that time, Earthworm Jim stood out in a positive way. And people noticed too. The game spawned a sequel, had toys, and it even had its own animated series that ran for 2 seasons. Where games like Bubsy and Battletoads failed, Jim succeeded. He was actually able to break through and come close to becoming a mainstream success. It seemed like the series would become a classic franchise that we would still be talking about to this day, and while we are still talking about it now, it's for a different reason. See, somewhere along the line, Earthworm Jim lost relevancy and dropped out of the public consciousness. And now I believe this was around 1999 when Earthworm Jim made the jump to 3D. Now on this first episode of the Fifth Dimension, we are going to take a look at how exactly this game went so horribly wrong. How was the gameplay of Earthworm Jim translated from the second to the third dimension? So before we do that, however, we have to of course examine the original game. Earthworm Jim was released in 1994 for the Super Nintendo and the Sega Mega Drive. The game stars Jim, of course, an earthworm, who is in possession of a super suit that makes him really strong. Along with that, he has a plasma blaster, a pocket-sized rocket, and he can use his own head to whip things and hang on to objects. Now, this isn't particularly deep gameplay, but it works. One of my favorite aspects about the original Earthworm Jim is the sheer amount of variety the game offers. You don't just run around blasting everything in sight whilst occasionally encountering a boss. On one level you are riding your pocket rocket through space, while on another you are fighting a huge booger while bungee jumping in a canyon. I mean, how about guiding another character through a level in fear of your own life? This is what elevates Earthworm Jim over what could have been just another mediocre platformer. It just so happens that everything around the gameplay is extremely solid too. The graphics, in part courtesy of animator Doug TenNapel, are incredible. This was done by digitizing traditional real animation pencil tests by scanning them and turning them into sprites. Because of this, Jim is very well animated and he's literally bursting with character. I'm serious, half of the game's appeal comes from just how great the animations and the overall presentation is. For example, leaving Jim alone for too long will cause him to jump rope with his head or accidentally shoot himself in the face. If you are more interested in this, I highly recommend checking out the documentary Shiny Entertainment Earthworm Jim The Making Of on YouTube and visiting the fan site rocketworm.com. There's a lot of information about the making of this game and it's very interesting, but it's not what this video is about. Anyway, the whole thing feels like a crazy game made by a bunch of guys who are finally let go and allowed to do their own thing. To me, it's just an explosion of raw creativity, and it's one of those rare instances where the fun they had making the game actually rubs off on you when you're playing. It's not to say the game's perfect though, because it definitely has its flaws. For one thing, Earthworm Jim is an incredibly difficult game, made even worse by the fact that you only have a few continues. When they run out, it's game over. Besides that, I'm not a huge fan of Jim's controls. Well, it's not that the controls are bad, it's just sometimes they feel a bit too twitchy or responsive. Whipping things with your head doesn't feel as good as, say, a Castlevania game. Trying to swing across hooks feels really finicky, especially later on in the game where you need to do this to survive. After a little practice, you get used to it, but still, it could have been better implemented. First of all, Earthworm Jim wasn't even developed by the original team at Shiny Entertainment. After they were bought out by publisher Interplay, the reins were handed over to a different developer, VIS Entertainment. The result? Well, at first it feels like Jim's moves have been translated pretty well from 2D to 3D. Take his shooting for example. Even though people classify Earthworm Jim as a run and gun type game, in the original game there's no actual running and gunning. You can only shoot while standing still in almost every direction. At first it seems limiting, but Earthworm Jim feels deliberately designed around this. Not once did I ever get the feeling that I was being limited by these controls. They just made sense since the levels in the game feel like they were designed around this particular type of gameplay. There are certain sections where there are enemies coming from every direction, so being able to stand still while you shoot feels like it has purpose. In Earthworm Jim 3D, however, this makes no sense at all. A lot of times you are confronted with multiple shooting enemies at the same time. Not being able to run and shoot at the same time, or at least lock on or circle strafe or something, makes these enemy encounters needlessly difficult, because you can only really focus on one enemy at a time. There are parts in the game where you get surrounded by enemies from all around you, but you have no means to shoot them effectively. In the original Earthworm Jim, there weren't that much enemies that shot you, but here, the game's full of them. This makes them not fun to fight, and every combat encounter is frustrating as a result. Not even to mention the god-awful first-person aiming mode. It's just horrible. Now, throughout the game, you are walking around in Jim's head, collecting golden udders. See, Jim had a cow drop on his head, which sent him into a coma. You are running around his subconscious trying to save yourself from being lobotomized or something. This is a really cool concept. Keeping in mind the crazy world that Jim lives in, imagine the kind of weird stuff that can happen inside his mind. Sadly, this never really amounts to much. In fact, it feels like an excuse just to have a generic hub from which you can access the other levels in the game. Like many other games of the time, Earthworm Jim 3D is a collect-a-thon platformer where you need to collect a certain amount of them for you to progress. I kept expecting them to do something new or creative with this, or at least I gotta make fun of it. But no, it just plays it straight. To me, this comes off as being incredibly uncreative in contrast to the original, which was like a big lampshading of all the different cliches that were going on at the time. It made the game stand out from the crowd, you know, it was unique. Earthworm Jim 3D just feels like a dime a dozen 3D platformer aping off the other games while not really introducing anything new on its own. It just feels generic and uninspired. The biggest example of where the game fails is a section where you need to escort Elvis after saving him from aliens. This part plays out exactly like the level For Pete's Sake in the original Earthworm Jim. Here you need to escort Peter Puppy through a level while saving him from bottomless pits and enemies by whipping him to other platforms and killing the enemies that stand in your way. It was a tough but somewhat fair level. If Peter Puppy falls down a hole or gets hit, you can try again, but he will take some of your health away. It's a stressful, difficult level that feels incredibly satisfying when you finally reach the end. This similar part in Earthworm Jim 3D feels like the complete opposite of this. If Elvis gets hurt or he falls down a hole, you need to go back to the beginning of the whole gauntlet. Whipping over a hole is so incredibly finicky that it's nearly impossible while walking around a tight corridor with an annoying camera and an Elvis that doesn't know when to shut his hole.
I'm the king, yeah.
In my opinion, this is the perfect contrast between what does and does not work in 2D and 3D. This one sequence is just a perfect illustration of what this entire game feels like to me. They carried over elements from the 2D games without realizing or thinking about how this would work at all in a three-dimensional environment. So even though this game sucks the proverbial big one, there are some positive things to be said. The voice acting done by Dan Castellaneta of Homer Simpson fame, returning from the animated series, is actually pretty solid. Jim also has a lot of different guns to collect in the game in every level, which is something that has a lot of potential. Just like some of the other elements, it just doesn't amount to much. It doesn't really feel like they utilized it as much as they could, but it's still a great original idea that they could have expanded upon. I mean, the game has a literal pea shooter in it. I can't help it. I mean, that's just really funny to me. Ultimately, the whole game feels uninspired and poorly designed. Even though they tried to add the variety of the original games, everything falls flat because it simply isn't fun to play. They literally translated Jim's moves from the earlier games without seeming to think about how they would work in a 3D environment, not knowing or caring enough to make them work. While I was playing, I constantly was thinking about how this could have worked better. Maybe if the gameplay would took a more similar form, like something like Ratchet and Clank or the Jak and Daxter games, it could have been more successful, but those games wouldn't get here for another console generation. The point is that Earthworm Jim was too little too late. By its release date in 1999, we already had games like Super Mario 64, Crash Bandicoot, Spyro, Gex, Croc, and Banjo-Kazooie, among tons of other more successful attempts at a game like this. Even the Earthworm Jim cartoon series was already done for a few years at this point. So ultimately, nobody cared, and Earthworm Jim sadly faded away, never to return again. Save for a remake in 2010, nothing new has been released on Earthworm Jim. In a world where we've actually gotten a brand new Bubsy game, this actually makes me sad. Someone please bring Jim back.